Okay, so this is our hopefully, I think, unless something goes very wrong, last session on Simondon's Imagination and Invention. So we're in the conclusion of the book at page 186 in the translation. So we just, I mean, to do a recapitulation, I think I'd have to go over the whole book essentially, but so I won't do too much of that. But the last session, I think we finished the part on, we finished part four, so the part on invention. And then we just started the conclusion and then decided not to sort of rush and try to finish it. So we broke it up into two sessions. The general idea that he's expressing here in this conclusion, the way that this cycle of the image has this sort of exteriorization function, and the way this relates to social interaction. An image in a sort of psychological sense is, of course, something only one person or one organism can, use. So if you have a sort of mental image of what your home territory looks like for whatever animal that is. That's like one particular animal's image of that territory. But then when the image becomes something like a drawing, an artifact, a technical object or something like that. So in this whole process of invention, the image now becomes something that can be used in social interaction. So I can make a drawing that depicts I don't know, I can make a map of a region, and then I can share it with someone else who's never been to that region, and then they have some limited but still valuable information about how to navigate in that territory. So there's this kind of function of externalization of the image. So the image becomes something separate from the organism that produces it, and this allows it to be shared with other organisms in social interaction. And of course, this in human societies, this is an extremely important element of social interaction. Like pretty much, I think it's probably universal among human societies to have some use of images of some kind, whether it's like geometrical designs or representations of objects or some sort of image use serving social functions or as a mediation of social relationships. So yeah, that's sort of what he talked about in the first bit of the conclusion that we looked at. And then, maybe the other point here is also this role of the change of the order of magnitude. So this is again sort of connected with this idea of externalization, but like the image in a psychological sense is sort of limited to it's a sub individual level. It's sort of a component of an individual organism. But then through this cycle of the image and then the process of invention and externalization of the image can be something sort of at a greater order of magnitude, or it becomes part of the environment of other organisms in a society of social organisms like human societies. So you can think of, for example, the symbolic images that we saw in part C, I believe, B of the book. These images, so you can think of like religious imagery or sort of historical narrative about like where our people fit into the history of the world, things like this. These types of images have a sort of greater than individual significance, so that it's not the case that it's not the case that the image is something confined to the life of one person, but a person is sort of incorporated into the functioning of one of these images. That you as an individual member of a society, you sort of function in such a way as to maintain these images and to preserve them and pass them on to the next generation. So again, a sort of change of scale of the image from something subpersonal to something suprapersonal. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit, and we should finish up this book today, and then we can talk about what we want to move on to next. Okay, so I'll do the first reading. Implications of the present proposal. It is worth specifying first the relative character of the created object. The created object is in fact a point of the milieu reorganized by the orientated activity of an organism. We can oppose neither human constructive operations to those practiced by animals, nor the fabrication of instruments smaller than the organism and borne by it to the setting up of roads, paths, storerooms, or limits in a territory serving as a media to the organism, and thus larger than it. The tool and the instrument, just as much as paths and protections, are part of the envelope of the individual and mediate its relation to the milieu. We must characterize this mediation topologically. Whether instrument, tool, or specific structure of a territory, the object bearing the results of an activity of invention has received a supplement of coherence, of continuity, of intrinsic compatibility, but also of compatibility with the non-elaborated remainder of the milieu and with the organism. These two external compatibilities with the quote-unquote wild milieu and the living individual are the result of the intrinsic compatibility that enables a single object to perform a simultaneous plurality of functions. A pathway, in order to exist according to internal compatibility, must be endowed with coherence and stability as a physical object, impermeability, the equal distribution of loads on the ground, etc. And the search for this internal compatibility is what appears foremost to be the goal of conscious and willful invention. There may be several formulas of compatibility according to the materials used. The Roman road is founded on a system of rigid sublayers. It is founded like a building. Today's roads are relatively elastic constructs that must be extremely waterproof and have optimal drainage. Their formula is the flexible continuity of their surface, much more so than the hardiness of each supporting block. When it ages, the Roman road is eroded one flagstone at a time, while the contemporary road loses its equilibrium across long undulations or buckles. External compatibility with respect to the subject may be summarized in terms of a viability for a definite mode of circulation and performance. Horse-drawn conveyances prohibiting sharp rises but allowing for sharp curves, loaded mules, fast engine-powered vehicles, etc. It is the characteristic of adaptation to a living being, whether direct or through a new and smaller mediation vehicle. External compatibility with respect to the general milieu is generated by the layout of the road according to the relief and composition of the terrain, including risks of avalanche, of mudslide, and so on. The road, as a resurfacing, developed supplementary mediations that connected to the wild milieu around it. Bridges, viaducts, tunnels, tree hedges, anti-avalanche reinforcement, preventative planting, sometimes at great distances like outposts. Internal compatibility then, which makes the road into a consistent construction, appears as a two-way transfer system between the living being and the milieu. When this compatibility is established, it enables the individual to move through the milieu in a continuous manner. But conversely, it also enables the preservation and reinforcement of engineering structures of safety and of protection. This self-constituting character of the created object is so strong that invention is generally a manner of treating a problem as solved in a non-tautological way. If one road is already built, it will be less difficult to build another a few feet away, thanks to the ease in transporting machines, workers, and materials. The solution consists in making this quote-unquote solved problem equivalent to a gradation of operations mutually enabling each other until completion, leveling, laying a gravel base, etc., until the last surfacing layer, whose finishing work requires an already perfectly leveled roadway. The created object is cumulatively organized by operations linked in a coherent manner, bringing the order of magnitude of the quote-unquote wild milieu closer to that of the individual operator. The category of the quote-unquote created is thus broader than that of invention, for it comes into being as soon as there is a cumulative and coherent effect of organization between the individual and the milieu, bringing an intermediary mode of mediation into existence. But it can also integrate inventions because of the created object's character of internal coherence and multiple compatibility, which develops optimally when the solved problem method can be used. The progress of the created object consists in a development of the intrinsic compatibility of the object, which extends the reach of the coupling between milieu and the living being. All created objects that are means of communication of a human origin, for instance, follow this development, derived from formerly used natural pathways, but increasingly tending towards internal modes of compatibility that enable a more extended and more universal penetration of the natural milieu. It is not each created object apart from the other that we should consider, but the universe of mediation they form, and in which each potentially serves as a means to the others. Right, so this has to do with, is connected with what I was mentioning at the beginning, this role of the object as a sort of externalization of the image. But here it's thought of in connection with the milieu. So an organism, like a human being, is always coordinate with an environment of some kind. And this, like we saw this at length in the individuation book, how the individual organism is always always a result of a process of individuation that separates it out from the milieu. And so when you have the result of an individuation, when you have an individual and a milieu, then there's some sort of mediation process that can happen between the two to sort of make aspects of that milieu more available or more easily manipulable by the organism. So the example that Simondon is going through here is the example of a road. So traveling through, say, a forest is relatively difficult. You have to sort of climb over tree branches on the ground, and it could be, streams or anyway, there's a variety of different obstacles to traveling through a forest that road making allows you to clear. So sort of the most basic one is just like, moving branches out of your path and making like a clear path through the forest. And this can be even like not a sort of planned road construction operation, but just through the action of many people traveling in a similar direction through the forest that clear a couple of obstacles each time. You end up having something like a path through the forest that's just created by the people that travel along that path. But then in more sort of formal road construction, you would like deliberately clear obstacles. You would level the surface to make it better for vehicles to travel over. You might build a bridge over a stream, etc. So you are making the environment more approachable by the organism, by an individual human being or a human being using a vehicle of some kind. And by this means you sort of mediate between the what he calls here the wild milieu, so the milieu is sort of separate from any human intervention, and then the organism within that milieu. So you're sort of taming the milieu, making it easier to manage, and in that sense, you're mediating between this sort of wild nature, this unmanaged state of the world, and then the human world. And so so this kind of mediation requires what he calls here internal and external compatibility. So in the internal compatibility is just the fact that any object that you're using as a kind of mediation has to whatever sort of function that object has to be sort of internally coherent. So like a road, for example, has to be constructed in such a way that it doesn't sort of destroy itself or that it doesn't degrade too quickly. So like you would use, for example, some sort of base layer of the road that prevents the surface from sinking or buckling or changing structure too dramatically or too quickly. And this just sort of ensures that the road as an object, can persist through time. It doesn't degrade, too quickly or too immediately. And then the external compatibility is just the way that the road mediates between the organism on the one side and the wild milieu on the other side. So it has to sort of be compatible with both. In some respect, it has to be compatible with the capacities that the individual organism has. So, like a road has to be wide enough for a person to walk on it, or wide enough for a vehicle if it's used by vehicles, etc. And then also it has to adapt to the environment. So it has to either follow the contours of a hill, or it has to cut out a path through the hill, a tunnel, for example, or in some way it has to adapt to the setting in which it finds itself. So it's adapted both to the individual organism and to the setting, and in that way it mediates between the two. Okay, so any comments or questions or anything about that bit before we move on?
I don't have any comments or questions, but I can read the next section.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the last bit was fairly straightforward. So yeah, go ahead.
And Let me know if my mic cuts out. I've been having trouble with my headphones. If we consider the created object as a mediator of the relation between living beings and the milia, it is less arduous to find the link between inventions among animal species and humanity. The use of instruments is indeed rather rare among animals, yet nothing forces us to consider the building and fabrication of instruments as the preeminent instance of invention. Instruments and tools are but a relay in the creation of objects, one more mediation between the created object and the living being creating it. Since a large number of animals are endowed either with specialized organs or with specialized operative modes connected to these organs, instrumental mediation is not necessary given this pre-adaptation. There is a direct relation of operative modes and organs to the activities that create objects, such as the building of a nest, the digging of a lair, and more generally, the construction of a territory. The created object exists as soon as a defined activity overdetermines the natural world, imparting to it a topology that expresses the presence of living beings according to a selective mode of behaviors. Simple visual or olfactory marking already represents a coherent demarcation, itself related to locations functionally connected to other activities, rest, food gathering, shelter, etc. By the same token, marking acquires a meaning for intra and interspecies social relations. The most concrete and complete created objects, such as nests and lairs, are also nexuses in intra and interspecies social relations, as well as mediators of the relation between living beings and the milieu. In some cases, the created object is highly multifunctional, such as the termite hill, which, in addition to having a high degree of all of the usual functions of the nest, thermoregulation, is also a pathway to the objects on which termites work. The created object is, first of all, the world as a reality organized into a territory. It is also the envelope of concrete individual existences in such a tight way that for some species the created object is almost fused with the organism, as in corals. Is the coenencheme a created object or an organism? We understand with such cases the continuity between functions of growth and the activity of creation, a genus of which invention is a species. Growth and invention converge in the production of the network of created objects. We cannot deny, however, that there is a difference, at least of degree, between the current capacities for the production of created objects by humans and by the animals most gifted in this respect. One of the main reasons for this difference lies in the multiplication of mediations among humans between the created object and nature, on the one hand, and the created object and the operator, on the other hand. The network of two-way pathways from nature to humans and humans to nature displays an indefinite anastomosis and a multitude of relays. Hence, the orders of magnitude made to communicate and interact in this way are much larger than in the animal realm, even in the best cases, social termites, in which the operator's activity cannot avail itself of a complex chain of mediations. The only angle through which an equivalence to the plurality of human mediations can be seen among animal species is that of the anatomic physiological specialization of individuals working cooperatively, or in the serialization of successive specializations of individuals across their life course, bees. In such instances, we encounter a plurality of developmental phases in the character of an organized cycle that we witness in the becoming of the mental image tending towards invention. This also seems fairly straightforward to me, that really what distinguishes the relationship between the human and the milieu from the relationship between other animals and the milieu is this the complexity of the technical envelope, as he calls it, with there being more mediating tools between the human being and the technical object, and then the technical object and the milieu for the human than there are for instance, termites, where there is a kind of, I don't know if you would call it a technical object or a kind of invention, created object that acts as an envelope that mediates between the animal and the milieu.
Yeah, like even a relatively simple technical object like a road, for example, you can already see that, like, building a road, beyond like the most basic, path through the forest that's just sort of cleared by trampling the undergrowth. As soon as you start using like say a machete to chop down vines and branches, or some sort of other tool that you use to level the surface, etc., you're already mediating it's not just one object mediating between the human being, the individual human organism, and the natural environment. Now you have like some tool that serves as a mediation to produce another object, namely the road, and then the road mediates between the human and the rest of the world. So you have at least two steps in this mediation, and of course that's a relatively simple technical object, something like I don't know. I mean, pretty much any object that we use today in our society has like many steps. You can think of like the production of plastic, for example. You have to extract petroleum from the earth. You have to do all sorts of chemical operations on that petroleum product to turn it into plastic, and that involves machines that have to have metal extracted from the earth and refined and manipulated in various ways. So like even a simple thing like I don't know, a toothbrush or whatever involves hundreds of other technical objects to produce the raw materials that are used to produce those machines that produce the toothbrush. So there's like this extremely complicated network of mediations, so that it's not just a sort of confrontation or encounter of the human individual with a natural environment. It's now this very complicated mediation between the individual organism and this network of technical objects that relate that individual organism to other organisms and to the natural environment. So yeah, much more complicated in terms of the degree of mediation, the number of steps of mediation, compared to even something like these social insects that have a very differentiated society of different roles that individuals perform within that society, and that produce things like a beehive or a termite nest that in some respects resemble a technical object. Oh, and I looked it up, and apparently it's pronounced Sinenkaim.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this refers. So it's kind of funny that he uses these technical terms, Sinenkaim and anastomosis in this conclusion, without ever like he's never used these terms in the book itself. So he's just sort of throwing them in.
You guys, you know what this is, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so Sinenkaim is the sort of common body that certain organisms like corals produce. So we saw this in the individuation book, where he talked about corals at pretty extensively. So they form these like colony forms, where multiple organisms or multiple semi-individual beings all sort of fuse together, or bud from each other, so that you have like it's very difficult to determine where is one individual coral, as opposed to like a whole group of corals. It's not obvious where the body of one individual begins and where the body of another one starts, and they share a circulatory system, for example, and the food that one coral takes in, the nutrients and stuff are distributed over the whole group of corals. So in that sense, they're like not really individuated into separate individual organisms. And anastomosis is apparently a medical term, which means connecting two portions of an organism. For example, like making a passage between two veins, but through surgery, two arteries. So this is used, I guess, to bypass a blockage or something like that. But anyway, so it essentially just means a connection between two things that are normally not connected.
I can't remember if he has talked about this kind of thing in the book thus far, but I think he has. I'm thinking about. I've read about. Sometimes archaeologists will, encounter objects from civilizations that no longer exist and not really know the function that these objects had in the civilization, despite the sort of obvious organic similarity between us and the people who were members of the civilization. And it seems like, especially with this proliferation of tools between nature and the human, the ability to, or the role of, I guess, educating members of the civilization into, or the group of people into a certain way of understanding the world and also of operating the tools necessary for at least part of this complex mediation seems inseparable from the use of the tools themselves. I don't know if he would consider, I remember he talked about formalization and giving commands and related that to like geometry textbooks. But I don't know if he would consider that educational process another series of inventions, or education as itself a kind of technical object.
Yeah, I think that would probably fit under this category that you mentioned of formalization, because you have, like, if you just sort of find a random tool that you have no idea what it does and you try to manipulate it, you're going to move it around in strange ways that don't really fit with the way that it's supposed to be used, or you're going to, the types of actions you would try to perform with this object probably are more varied than what you're supposed to use it for. Whereas someone who actually knows what it's for will use it in the specific ways that it's designed for. And so part of what it means to learn how to use a tool is to like restrict your movements and operations on that tool or using that tool to the ones that it's designed for. Like you use a hammer to hit a nail and not to hit a screw, for example. And whereas you would use a screwdriver to screw in a screw and not to hit the nail. So like once you know how to use an object, and once you're trained how to use that object, you use the object for a restricted set of movements or operations in a way that you wouldn't if you have no idea what the object is for. So it formalizes the types of gestures and actions you would potentially try to perform using this object, sort of restricts it to a kind of like stereotyped set of motions that is like sort of coordinate to that object. So yeah, I think it fits. It's similar in some ways to like the way that a religious ceremony, for example, involves like specific types of actions that you perform, in this setting at this time, etc. Likewise, performing an operation on using a technical object requires performing certain motions in certain circumstances, and then other motions in a different circumstance, and knowing how to distinguish one from the other. And so yeah, you have to be sort of trained into using that technical object in the correct way.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think of that as part of this envelope of the organism, sort of ways of understanding the tools, but also probably of understanding the world that you interact with through the use of those tools.
Yeah, and there's like I mean, part of the sort of training that you get in the use of tools can be like a way of what we would call more specifically a way of understanding the world. So you might have like a classification of materials, for example, like what types of objects do you use a saw on? Like mostly you use it on wood, but you might have some sort of quasi theoretical understanding of like these are the type like sawable materials, primarily wood, maybe some other materials as well, but bone or something. So like using a saw requires a classification of the world into sawable materials and other unsawable materials. Or whereas using a chisel, you would use it on like stone primarily, and so like you would classify the world into materials that can be chipped using a chisel, and other materials that are too soft for that. So yeah, like you might have some sort of quasi-theoretical understanding of the world in terms of classifying entities based on what tools are appropriate or effective in manipulating those entities, and that can be even developed into something closer to a theoretical science, like a lot of Aristotle's works can be seen as a sort of systematization of that kind of pre-theoretical understanding of the world. Like I'm thinking of the meteorology book 4, I believe, is like a sort of classification of a representation of the world in terms of the elements, the fire, air, water, and earth, and like how different elements interact with each other. So this is like a sort of theoretical picture of the world that's based on like what types of operations you can do with entities, like solids you can pick up and manipulate, liquids you have to put into a container of some kind, etc. So yeah, learning how to use objects in the correct ways will sort of go along with a picture of what types of entities are there in the world that you can manipulate with those objects or use those objects on.
I wonder, and this is maybe going too far afield, but if the development of technology is driven by kind of the need for like valorization of capital, for instance, then and if the use of technology involves a certain way of looking at the world, then it seems that civilization that technological advancement of which is driven by a need for valorization will end up seeing the world differently than a civilization in which technological advancement is driven by different motives.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But I think what Simondon would also point to is this, like he talked about in the in individuation, this role of like the technician as sort of mediating or having this connection to something extra social. And so like part of producing technical objects, even in a capitalist society, there's of course the motivation of producing objects that, for example, allow you to minimize the labor time required to produce some other object. But the machine or whatever technical object, it has to actually work. You have to actually use properties of existing materials or invent a new material that has the right properties, or you have to use some sort of aspects of the natural world in the appropriate ways to bring about the effect that you want. You can't just sort of like decree that your object is going to work at the at reducing the labor time required to produce some other object. Like a steam engine has to take advantage of various thermodynamic properties, and those properties of thermodynamic interactions are not like sort of are not brought about by capitalism as such. They might be revealed through the use of steam engines in capitalist production processes, but they aren't produced themselves by capitalist production process. So this role of the technician, I think for Simondon would be sort of a two-sided role. On the one hand, a technician, of course, wants to, part of the role of the technician is to ensure that technical objects are functioning in such a way that they do serve the purposes of the owners of those technical objects. And in a capitalist society, that it's the capitalists who own the technical objects. But then on the other hand, the technician has to actually take advantage of existing properties of the natural world, capacities that different substances have, different forces, etc., and manipulate those elements of nature, arrange them in the right way. Just in general, has to connect with something that is not strictly social and use that element of nature in such a way as to bring about the desired effect. There's like a sort of two-sided role of the technician, I think, for Simondon. And of course, it's like you can't really separate out those two roles in any clean or like strict way, because we can only ever understand the world, the natural world, by using the concepts that we actually have available to us, and those concepts are mediated by the sort of social arrangements, what kind of technical objects we have available to us, what kind of education we have experience, etc. All those concepts are sort of part of our social heritage, what we inherit from the preceding generations. So we can only ever use the concepts that we actually have available to us, and those concepts are in part shaped by the form of the society in which we live. So we don't have like a sort of unmediated access to what the natural world consists in separately from human social categories, for example. But at the same time, we can't like reduce our relationship with the natural world to something that it would be purely social, that we can just sort of decree what that relation would be. So there's like a more complicated and hard to express relationship where we use different properties of the natural world for different social functions, and we understand that aspect of the natural world in relation to those social functions, but never in a sort of reduction of one to the other. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I think this will take us to the end of the conclusion. So I can read the last bit. Within this perspective provided by the analysis of the created object, the study of the mental image could become a particular case of the study of a larger set of phenomena. It is through the final phase of invention that the cycle of the mental image might reveal that it belongs to the general category of self-organizing processes of activity, one of whose major aspects in human societies is the organization of work. We could then understand how, guided originally by the vector of motor tendencies, projecting encounters with objects, the mental image is charged with exteroceptive information before being formalized into symbols of reality in order to serve as the basis of an organizing invention. To this end, besides exceptional cases where a spectacular and large-scale reorganization propagates through a society and becomes a new landmark, there is a continuous web of implicit reorganizations interwoven in work, but which are neither generalized nor propagated outside of the fields of application for which they were meant. And yet such minor reorganizations are also inventions, and the force of distributed inventions within a task, each too minimal to propagate outside of the situation, may be as important as a massive act of invention that organizes a situation in one blow, together with all analogous situations. This is especially the case in the animal activity of object creation, which minutely adjusts tasks to themselves and to the milieu during their performance. This is also the case of artisanal production. Each task comprises a certain number of organizing actions, and if the scope of each of these actions is inferior to the dimension of the task, the created object remains essentially dependent on the particular conditions of its insertion within the milieu, on its end, and on the particular means of its realization. These inventions do not emerge outside of the operator, which may reproduce them in the course of analogous tasks, but not formalize them as an absolute. This is the case with animal or artisanal activity, in which invention is distributed throughout its execution. Conversely, if the act of invention is concentrated over several tasks, it is formalized into an invention detachable from its conditions of performance, as in industrial work. Finally, a remarkable particular case is that of the dimensional adequation between an artwork and an organizing invention. The created object is entirely organized in a single act, without residue or fuzzy areas, but this action does not exceed the limits of the created object, which thus remains particular and unique. The art object, a stable intermediary between artisanal fabrication and industrial operation, is a completely organized object, and in this respect absolute, albeit singular. Within the artisanal object, invention remains within the limits of the performance of tasks, bringing about partial organizational linkages. Within the industrial object, invention exceeds the performance of tasks. Within the artwork, invention and the performance of tasks occur at the same time and have the same dimension. The study of the mental image and of invention thus leads us to praxeology, quote, the science of the most universal forms and the most elevated principles of action within all living beings, unquote, according to the 1880 definition by Alfred Espinasse in the article titled Les origines de la technologie, the origins of technology, published in La Revue philosophique de la France et de l'étranger. Praxeology, together with the research of Slutsky, then Bogdanov, Technology, Moscow, 1922, has developed in the direction of the economy and the organization of human activity. Osterled has also confirmed this trend towards the study of human activity, as well as Tadej Stolovsky Les principes de l'action efficace, Principles of Effective Action, Warsaw, 1960, cited by Kotarbinsky in Les origines de la praxéologie, The Origins of Praxeology. But it is reasonable to think that after having separated humans from animals and utilitarian action from action in general, praxeology could become a general praxeology, integrating the study of the most elementary forms of activity, which would in fact fit rather well with other investigations by Espinasse. At this juncture, the cycle of the mental image progressing toward invention may well appear to be an advanced level of the activity of living beings considered, even in its most primitive forms, as autokinetic systems interacting with a milieu. The autokinetic aspect that manifests itself through the motor initiatives in less advanced life forms is translated within life forms endowed with complex nervous systems by spontaneity of functions which triggers before the encounter with the object the cycle of the image and which is concluded by invention. Right. So yeah, I think this bit is also relatively straightforward. He essentially is just pointing this whole, or he's connecting the studies throughout this set of lectures that we just concluded towards this field of praxeology, which a few of the people that he cites here have proposed. I don't think it ever really developed into a sort of field of research on its own, but he's suggesting that there's a continuity between the motor activity of organisms as such. So you can think even here of like bacteria, extremely simple living beings in some respects. There's a continuity between this kind of motor activity on the one hand, and then human technical and artistic production on the other. So these are not like qualitatively distinct forms of action or activity. They're obviously very different in certain respects in terms of the complexity of mediations involved and so on. But they're qualitatively the same. They're just in one is just more mediated and more complex in certain respects than the other. So we want to understand the human process of invention of technical objects and creation of artistic objects as a sort of special case of the general property of living beings of what he calls autokinetic systems. So living beings are entities that bring about their own motion and development and sort of spontaneity, I guess, in a broad sense here, not specifically in the Kantian sense, but living beings have this sort of internal principle of motion and development that non-living beings don't have, or at least not to the same degree. And this bit is also interesting, I think, in connection with there's been fairly recently research into what's sometimes called basal cognition, and this is looking at living beings like bacteria, slime molds, and unicellular organisms and otherwise very simple beings as exhibiting something like cognition or something analogous to cognition that we would recognize in humans or other mammals or birds or whatever. So like I forget what, I think it might be E. coli, but anyway, some form of bacteria, they have like signaling processes. They recognize the amount of nutrients in their environment, and they secrete some kind of signaling chemical. And then if there's not enough nutrients in the environment, and that means the signaling chemical is the concentration of that signaling chemical increases when there's not enough nutrients. And then when it reaches a certain threshold, the bacteria form a sort of colony stage and then release a spore that can travel further to another region where there might be higher concentrations of nutrients. So like they respond to the conditions in their environment in such a way as to produce an adaptive behavior. And this is sort of a general like definition of what we would understand by cognition. So they're not just sort of biological machines that respond in a very simple way to individual variables of their environment, but they actually integrate information from in different forms about their environment. They can cooperate in sophisticated ways, etc. So yeah, there's been a lot of research over the last like 10, 20 years into these forms of activity in single-celled organisms that they exhibit a lot more sophisticated behavior than was previously recognized. And so I think Simondon would be very interested in this kind of research and would see this as a sort of confirmation of his general approach to study human, sophisticated human behaviors like technical invention, artistic production, and so on, in continuity with other organisms, and starting with other mammals, but looking beyond that into even single-celled organisms. So this is like part of the whole process of the development of living beings is precisely this capacity to adapt to the environment and also to adapt the environment to the organism's needs and interact between those two sort of directions of fit. So yeah, I think this kind of research is very interesting and something that Simondon would probably also be very interested in. Yeah, that's something. So Angus has put in the chat about Jains, the religious group in India who are very strict in terms of their dietary requirements. They don't eat any plants that you have to kill to eat, like root vegetables, for example, where you have to dig up the plant to eat it. And what exactly the ethical implications are of this kind of understanding of cognition as being coextensive with life in some respect. It's something I haven't really thought about that much, but yeah, I haven't really seen anyone talk about that, but yeah, there's a lot of evidence about cognition in plants as well. That plants are like the same way as I was describing for bacteria. Plants are they're not just sort of biological machines. They integrate information. They explore their environment. They respond to the opportunities and dangers of their environment in sophisticated ways, etc. It's just the fact that they do so much more slowly than animals do makes it hard for us to sort of appreciate that sophistication of plants. So like one of the sort of basic tools of studying plant cognition is just the time-lapse video, where you just record a plant over the course of an hour or a day or whatever, and then you replay it at much higher speeds, and then you can see like it just looks much more responsive. It's like you see the plant responding to something like vines, for example, that grow up a pole. Like you can see the way that they sort of explore their environment until they find the pole, and then they start grasping it and growing upwards if you record them over the course of a day or several days. So yeah, it's like partly it's just some limitations of like again, this is sort of a mediation of scale issue because the time scale at which plants respond is so much slower than our time scale that it's hard for us to to recognize them as cognitive entities. But then the technical object, the camera and the capacity to replay a recording at a greater speed mediates between our time scale and the plant's time scale and allows us to actually recognize that and understand the plant as a cognitive entity. But yeah, like what exactly the ethical implications of this are, is hard to figure out exactly. Obviously, we need to eat something. If all living beings are cognitive in some respect, we humans, of course, have to absorb nutrients from other living beings. We can't photosynthesize, that means we have to. Our nutrition requires absorbing nutrition from other cognitive beings, and so yeah, what exactly that means for the ethics of eating, I'm not sure. So were there any other like comments or questions or anything else we should bring up before we move on to what we want to read next?
Nothing else from me. It was a pretty straightforward conclusion.
Yeah, surprisingly, like compared to the conclusion of individuation, which like raises all kinds of strange problems.
Right.
This one's relatively straightforward. So I would suggest that we can stop the recording and just discuss off recording, and then we can post in the channel to what exactly we decide on, if that's okay with everyone.
That sounds good.
Okay, so I will stop the recording.